To me, this is one of the more interesting chapters because it really kind of delves in our environment and our experiences and how it shapes us emotionally and psychologically. Um, so in this chapter, we'll touch a little bit on the differences between nature and nurture, how they're different, and how sociology takes a look at both of those dynamics. Both of those deal with our behavior as humans, and the main question is it mostly driven by our genetics or our environment? We're going to define socialization. We'll take a look at gender roles, how gender is learned and socialized by different aspects of our environment, everywhere from the family to church to different agencies. We'll take a look at adapting to life changes. So in this section here, we'll talk about a term called resocialization and another term called mortification of self. We're going to take a look at some of the negative effects of abuse and neglect, what can happen whenever people are physically abused, emotionally abused, psychologically abused, and also whenever people are neglected, it can have pretty devastating effects on people that are lifelong. They can follow them for many, many years. And from there, we'll finish up taking a look at different types of theories that kind of explain the sense of self. So pretty much everything in this chapter is on the micro level. So if you remember in chapter 1, we talked about the sociological imagination, how our experiences shape our perception. But our experiences, they don't just shape our perception, but they also shape our feelings. And they also shape the way we interact with each other. So the nature-nurture debate, like I mentioned, is the main debate is our behavior, the things that we do, is it more driven by our sex, being the biological male or biological female, various types of hormones, estrogen versus testosterone, genetic predispositions that we may inherit from our parents and our grandparents, or is a lot of our behavior going to be driven more from our environment, our experiences, and the way that we are treated? And so a lot of things are being debated here. So whether it's our personalities, our levels of intellect, how sexuality can be influenced by our genetics and hormones, but also environmentally, various forms of addictions. Sometimes addictions is believed that there can be a genetic predisposition that you inherit certain types of issues with alcoholism and drug addictions from your parents, especially fetal alcohol syndrome. If you're in the womb and the mother is either drinking or doing drugs, or maybe a genetic predisposition for you to really kind of struggle with drugs or alcohol in the future. Also, various forms of mental disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So essentially, sociology is going to be looking mostly at the nurture side, the environmental side, because that's what the discipline focuses on mostly. How our upbringing, how our experiences, positive experiences, negative experiences, trauma really kind of shape us. But that doesn't mean that sociology rejects biology. It doesn't reject biology. So sociology understands that there are genetic predispositions, that biology does have an effect, that our sex hormones, genetic predispositions, the things that we inherit genetically can have a biological effect on our behavior. And a lot of times biologists will actually take a look at twin studies. People who have either they're identical twins or they are fraternal twins where their genetic makeup is either identical or very, very close. And the one thing that we do know is that there are certain types of cognitive disorders and struggles that there is a genetic predisposition, such as anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and also schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is highly, highly genetic. If one of your parents or both parents have schizophrenia, it does increase your chances of having schizophrenia. If you are an identical twin, I believe you have somewhere around a 70 to 75% chance of having schizophrenia if your identical twin has it. A lot of times, schizophrenia, though, can actually lay dormant. It actually is kind of in a sleeping state. Schizophrenia, where you are hallucinating, whether it's a visual hallucination or an auditory hallucination, sometimes it's kind of sleeping. Most of the time, schizophrenia doesn't manifest or actually wake up until somewhere in your early 20s. And sometimes what wakes it up actually is environmental stressors or anxiety. So even though most people, the issues of hallucinations won't kind of manifest until your early 20s. The thing we do know is that sometimes through the abuse of drugs and alcohol and hallucinogenic drugs, it'll actually wake up the hallucinations where it actually starts to manifest. So what's interesting about schizophrenia is that, yeah, there's a very strong genetic component to schizophrenia that is hereditary, but there are environmental stressors, especially if there's abuse of drugs and psychedelics, to actually kind of wake that up. From my perspective, all of this is on a spectrum. It's very individual from one person to the next. There are some people that may be driven mostly behaviorally because of their environment, the way that they were raised. There are other people, there may be very strong genetic predispositions to their types of behaviors. To me, it's not an either or situation. It's really more on a kind of a gray spectrum. From my perspective, all the things that are being debated, you could probably easily argue that there's a genetic component and there's also an environment component as well. And that's why the debate continues. Don't really always know. I mean, the human condition is exceptionally complex. And for us to ever get to a point to say 100% sexuality or personality or intellect is always biological or always environmental, there's just too much variations in the human condition to be able to definitively say things like that. Socialization. So kind of being raised. So socialization is the lifelong process where we are prepared to function in society as adults. We're being socialized or being taught. So socialization begins at home with the family. And socialization begins day one, from the moment of birth. Anything that's kind of put in place, and this is why it's important to be raised in a very loving, nurturing environment, because our objective in raising our kids is to get them to a point where they can independently leave the house, take care of themselves, have children themselves if they choose to in the future, and to raise children for the next generation. So socialization is everything from, learning how to be potty trained to getting dressed, undressed, driving a car, balancing checkbook, anything functionally, reading, writing, anything that we learn to do that kind of helps us function in society is socialization. Body language, eye contact, shaking hands, those kind of soft skills, and teaching us how to interact with people appropriately. We have to learn those things. Our parents have to teach those things. When we do something that is considered socially inappropriate, a lot of times our parents will reprimand us for it and may correct us for that, because they understand that it's not socially acceptable to say or do certain things. So even that aspect kind of prepares us for adulthood. So that is socialization. Acting human. It sounds a little bit unusual to even talk about that, but the reason that we act like human beings is not simply because we were born Homo sapiens, that we were born as human, but also we were raised by human beings. And so with the video that we just saw, if you're raised by other types of animals or you're severely neglected, then there's a good chance you may not act human at all. And this is something that George Herbert Mead actually talked about. He said the reason that children grow up and they act like humans and they interact as humans is because they're raised by humans. And the way that they do this through playing. So if you have a small child that is in the kitchen and they are pretending to cook with some pots and pans as mom or dad is at the stove cooking, Well, we may look at that child and say, well, that's cute. My little boy is playing, but actually, he's actually learning because he's watching what you're doing and he's mimicking what you're doing. So he's actually slowly learning how to cook. And as the child gets a little bit older, then the parent brings the child up to the stove and actually starts to teach the child how to cook themselves. And so the ultimate goal is, whenever the child is a teenager or a young adult, is that they can actually cook for themselves in a safe manner. So this is what George Herbert Mead talks about. He says that children, they learn to act human through play. They mimic their parents, they mimic significant others. But it's not just through the process of mimicking and play that's important, it's also the interaction of the parents to the child during that, by correcting them, by teaching them, by showing them how to do certain types of things. If a father is outside and he's teaching his young son how to change the oil in the truck, well, by the time that little boy is a grown man, then he knows how to do those types of things. So we learn how to act human through play. Let's take a look at some other agents or agencies of socialization. So I mentioned first that the primary agency of socialization, how we're socialized, is the family, because this is where socialization begins. But there are other agencies of socialization that prepares for adulthood. It's not just our parents. So obviously schooling is going to be really important. Learning how to read, learning how to write, basic math skills. But whenever we go to school, there's a lot of other things that we learn as well that goes outside of academia. We learn how to cooperate with each other. We learn how to make friends. We learn how to respect authority, raising your hand. A lot of times these things kind of prepare us for the workforce. In school, we learn about capitalism, democracy, the voting process, nationalism. All these things, they kind of prepare us. In school, we learn soft skills like I mentioned earlier, like eye contact and how to actually get along with people, the levels of compromise, which is going to be important in the workplace as well. These things we learn from a very, very young age. Another agency of socialization are going to be peer groups. So these are going to be our friends. These are going to be really important in cultivating relationships because we are social creatures. It's important for us as small children, as we get older, to learn how to cultivate healthy relationships, how to make friends, how to have a healthy debate with each other, to start to recognize that a certain relationship may be toxic or unhealthy and that you should probably not be friends with this individual anymore. We start to learn how to communicate. We have communication skills. As we get a little bit older, we start to move into sexuality and intimacy, and that kind of moves us into various forms of sexual and intimate types of relationships. And all of these types of interactions, they start at a very small age. Another agency of socialization is going to be the work environment. And a lot of times we kind of pick up these skills whenever we're teenagers, whenever we have our first job, whenever we're in high school or possibly in college. So if we have a little part-time job, we learn how to make money. We learn how to manage money. We learn how to go to work on time. We learn how to interact with other coworkers. We learn how to deal with a boss. We learn conflict resolution within the work environment. So what does this do? This prepares us for our careers. But again, we're learning this at a very, very young age, even as teenagers. But they all kind of get us ready for that career. The mass media is going to be another agency of socialization. We've talked a little bit about being very critical and very careful of kind of the things that we're actually kind of feeding ourselves visually and also psychologically. But the mass media shapes our cultural values, our perception of global events, our political ideas of fashion, technology, sexuality, gender roles. So when you're dealing with the media or pop culture, it has a huge kind of influence on our perception of the world around us. And that's why we have to look at that through a critical lens, because not everything that we're feeding ourselves through a phone or through a screen is necessarily good information, positive information, or even accurate information. So we got to kind of look at that through a critical lens and really ask ourselves, what are we feeding ourselves, and how is it affecting not only how I feel about myself, but also how am I interacting with other people? You know, they just had a study come out where some psychologists were highly concerned with the youngest generation obsession with social media, and how this obsession with social media is causing a lot of issues with some young people isolating themselves, having difficulty communicating with other people, but also creating a negative self-image based on what they're seeing on Instagram and pop culture in regards to people doing selfies, body image type of issues. So there's a lot of concern there about what's kind of happening whenever we're disconnecting on a human level and we're isolating ourselves behind screens and behind closed doors. So when it comes to socialization, sometimes it's positive socialization and sometimes it's dysfunctional. So we're going to kind of delve in a little bit. We're going to take a look at gender and how that's learned. So gender roles are society's expectation of appropriate behavior based on one's sex. These are called gender roles, and these are things that are highly conditioned by society. And the reason that we know this is by people like Margaret Mead. She's a very famous anthropologist that back in the 1930s, she spent a lot of time among three tribes that lived pretty close geographically to each other in New Guinea off the coast of Australia. And so this is kind of that nature-nurture debate. The nature side would say that men are aggressive, they're thick-skinned, they're more domineering, and then on the other side, because you're born female, that you may be more passive and more delicate and more fragile. Some of those gender role stereotypes. But with people like Margaret Mead, who really kind of started to take a look at various tribes, we really started to understand that gender roles are something that's heavily taught and conditioned in society. You should notice this among these three tribes here. The first one is called the Arapesh people. And this is a particular tribe that was highly aggressive, highly violent. And at one time within the Arapesh people, they were cannibals. So they ate other humans, exceptionally violent. So when it comes to the men and the women, they were both highly masculine, highly aggressive, and highly violent because that's the environment that they were raised in. They were both male and female, but because they were raised in that environment, they were highly aggressive, highly dominant. The Mundagumor tribe, or these people, very passive, very peaceful, not violent at all. And so what we would look here is that both males and females had more of what we would consider a feminine type of characteristic. Passive, gentle, caring, and loving. That's because that's the environment that they were raised in. There wasn't a need for hostility or violence within this very peaceful tribe. And so this environment kind of conditioned them to be very peaceful and passive. The Chimbuli tribe, this was interesting because their gender roles were polar opposite of each other. This was or still is, a matriarchal tribe, which is a female-dominated tribe where females have more power and authority over males. And so the females within this tribe were raised to be dominant, aggressive, authoritarian, and really kind of running things. And the males were expected to be very passive and very dependent. So the gender roles were pretty much the opposite here. So this kind of shined a light a little bit and kind of gave us some inside information on how when it comes to gender roles, a lot of it is conditioned in society. Like here in the United States, we're seeing a blurring of the gender roles. We're seeing it very much blurred. If you go to other parts of the world that are heavily patriarchal or male dominated, there's a very strong line between the roles of men and the roles of women, and the behaviors of men and the behaviors of women. It's not very much blurred. There's a very, very defined line between that. Culturally, religiously, politically, on the family level, on every level. Here in the US, it's becoming blurred. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. And that's because environment kind of shapes that. So gender socialization is how gender is socialized or taught. This is going to start primarily with the family, just like any type of socialization. Gender socialization is going to start with the family because this is where we go day one. So if we start to separate children based on the kind of clothes that they wear, boy clothes versus girl clothes, boy colors versus girl colors, boy toys versus girl toys. Really, pretty much from day one, we start to kind of separate children. And the small child may not fully understand this until they get a little bit older. But as the child gets a little bit older, somewhere around the age of 5, going into kindergarten, they've had 5 years of conditioning where they really start to understand, hey, I'm a boy and I'm not a girl. We are different from each other. And so the family kind of starts really kind of separating this. Like I said, we're kind of moving into society now where for a long time there was very strong traditional beliefs that little boys act this way and little girls act this way. And what we're all able to see now is that through the media, through commercials, through social media, that a lot of this is being blurred. Even the way that parents are kind of interacting with their children. Most parents interact with their children in traditional ways. You know, they try to instill masculinity with boys and femininity with girls. But there are some parents that are starting to bring about what's called androgynous parenting. Androgynous parenting. So what that is, that's that blurring of those lines where parents, especially younger generation parents, are more accepting and tolerant of their young sons acting in more, say, traditional feminine ways. Maybe he's artistic, he's musically inclined, he may like to wear pink. And so if you come from like an androgynous type of parenting style, they may kind of let that go. And some may even take it to an extreme where they may actually encourage that. And that's a different topic or discussion.
How do you spell that?
Androgynous? A-N.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
A-N-D-R-O-G-E-N-O-U-S, maybe? You may have to Google that one. It's called androgynous, where it's kind of blurred, yeah. So yeah, it could be also what's known as kind of gender fluid. And we see this with the younger generation, little boys and little girls just feeling more free to kind of expressing themselves in various types of ways. Peer groups also have a big impact on gender socialization because before we get into puberty and then sexuality is kind of introduced, for the most part, small children are playing in same-sex groups. And if you're playing in same-sex groups, and a lot of times if you drive by elementary schools and they're outside playing and during recess, you'll notice for the most part, boys are playing with boys and girls are playing with girls. So what happens here is that among boys hanging out with each other is that masculinity is reinforced. And so if you're acting kind of tough and masculine, you may get respect, feel good about yourself. But at the same time, if you're a little boy who's artistic, sensitive, smart, quiet, they may be bullied. They might be made fun of. So how does this shape behavior? Well, it can reinforce masculinity, but the little boy who is being picked on and being bullied, he may start saying to himself, I don't like being bullied, so I'm going to toughen up. I'm going to start acting a little bit different, acting more masculine. So that's how I can kind of shape it and move that to the masculine side. But we also know that little girls are notoriously cruel as well. And so through peer groups and being mean and bullying, that can also shape the behavior and the perspective of little girls, how they see themselves and even how they interact as well. So when it comes to these peer groups, they use both praise and punishment to kind of shape gender roles, to kind of move it, because nobody likes to be picked on. And I'll give you a quick example of how this happened to me. when I was about 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, it was a beautiful Saturday, and I was playing outside, and I was so full of joy, I decided I was going to skip all the way home. And so my house was at the bottom of a hill, and I was at the top of a hill, and I started skipping all the way home. And I heard laughter to my right, and two of my friends, they were pointing at me and they were laughing. They were laughing at me. They were making fun of me because I was skipping all the way home. And I remember whenever they did that, I remember I got embarrassed and I decided to stop skipping. And so I started to walk normal home and I waved to them, and I remember kind of puffing up my chest a little bit. So I was punished that day for doing that. Do you think that they would have laughed and pointed at me or made fun of me if I was Dana, a little girl, instead of a little boy?
Mhm.
Probably not. They would have allowed Dana to kind of skip all the way home. But I remember that. And students probably all of us in here can probably think of one example of how our behavior was kind of shaped through either reinforcing it through the positive or punishing it or bullying it in some sort of way. And it may sound a little bit silly, but I think it's a factor in why women live longer than men. Society allows women to be more expressive, to be more in touch with their feelings. They're more likely to seek counseling and therapy to deal with their problems. They take better care of themselves. They're less likely to turn to drugs and alcohol to self-medicate. But for a lot of young men that are growing up, showing any sign of weakness or showing any type of weakness there's a lot of ridicule there. So you have a lot of young men these days that won't verbally talk about their feelings and express those things. They'll kind of stuff those things, which is not a healthy way to deal with it. And then guys are also more likely to drink and to self-medicate to deal with stress and anxiety. So I know it may sound a little bit silly, but the fact that a lot of men may be pressured to kind of keep things in and be tough, I do think it has not only a psychological effect, an emotional effect on us, but also I think it internally it can create a biological, physiological effect dealing with stress and how we deal with it. But I do think things are getting better. I think the younger generation today of young men are more likely to be expressive, to seek help. So I think that's a positive thing. Religion can also reinforce gender roles as well, especially if you come from a very ultra conservative type of religious family. They may have very strong feelings about the husband or the father's role in the family, his position over the family, his responsibilities versus the wife and the mother, and her role may be more of a support system for the father and also taking care of the household and primarily taking care of the kids and supporting your husband. You would find this kind of reinforcing those gender roles in very ultra conservative religious families. But at the same time, you do have some religions that are very liberal, extremely liberal, and they believe in gender equality and conservation and these types of things. A really good example of that would be the Unitarian Universalist. The Unitarian Universalists often do not advertise. You usually have to seek and find them out. They have a Unitarian Universalist church in Little Rock. They've got one in Baton Rouge. They're usually in much larger cities. And this type of church tends to be very, very liberal. They take aspects of all different world religions and they kind of combine them together. And they tend to believe highly, highly in gender equality. So just because you're a religious individual doesn't mean that you would automatically believe in traditional gender roles. It may be much more ambiguous. The media can also reinforce gender roles. We see this through television series. We see this through various types of movies, commercials that are kind of reinforcing buying certain types of products. A lot of times whenever kids are watching various commercials, it can reinforce masculinity and femininity based on the type of uh, toys that they're trying to market to the children. So the media also plays a part visually in kind of reinforcing gender roles as well. A lot of times if you see cleaning products that are being kind of marketed, It's kind of changing a little bit where men are being shown in commercials in regards to buying cleaning products, doing sweeping. But for the most part, a lot of times it's marketed towards women because they know that women are more likely to actually to buy these actual products. So if you have a little girl that's watching this commercial about a particular broom or a cleaning product and they're seeing a female, a woman actually using this product, sometimes it can reinforce that, well, that's what a woman does. A woman cleans, and I'm a woman, so it can kind of reinforce that. But we are seeing the blurring of these gender roles because recently I've seen a commercial where you have a father that was changing diapers, things that you would have never seen back in the 80s and before. You wouldn't have seen a commercial where a guy had a diaper bag and carrying his son and changing diapers. I think it's a good thing, but what it does show you is the kind of the blurring of these gender roles. So things are changing. Okay. Do you have any comments or questions so far? Okay, so let's dive into what's known as resocialization and mortification of self. So adapting to life changes. So we define socialization, the lifelong process we're prepared to function in society as adults. Resocialization is whenever there's a major adjustment that comes, and this is just part of life. There's always going to be changes that occur where we have to readjust to new statuses, new roles, new experiences. So this is called resocialization. Adjusting to new roles during major life transitions. So if you go through a divorce, all of a sudden you're not married anymore. You're going to obviously have to go through a major transition. You're going to have to re-socialize yourself in your life. Whenever you graduate high school and you go off to college, and maybe you move out of the house, and maybe you move into a dorm or you move into an apartment, now you're taking on more adult responsibilities. You have to kind of be re-socialized to that. If you have a child and you bring a child home, a disability, retirement, a bad accident, any type of thing that can kind of hit people sideways, you're going to have to kind of re-socialize that and kind of go through the process of kind of putting your life back together. And this kind of usually evolves two categories. One is the positive and the second was the negative. Whenever we're going through positive life changes, graduating college, getting married, having a kid, buying our first home, these can be very exciting times in our lives. Falling in love, very, very exciting. It's a major transition, but we're on that high and things are very, very positive. But the longer that we live, there's going to be times where there's going to be major hardships in our lives, devastating losses, death, disability, job loss, bankruptcy. So it's easy to kind of ride the highs, but the question is that whenever you're going through the deepest, darkest times of your life, how do you adjust through that to get on the other side? And sometimes whenever people are going through a really devastating time in their life where they feel broken and they've gone to their knees, they turn to dysfunctional ways of dealing with the pain. What are some dysfunctional things that some people do to deal with pain and hardship that may not be the best way to deal with their situation?
Self-medicating.
Self-medicating, so alcohol and drugs. Yeah. What are some other things some destructive things that people do when they're going through a hard time outside of drugs or alcohol? Yep. What do you think? Self-harm. Yeah. Could be cutting, self-harm. Yeah. You think of anything else? Promiscuity. Sometimes people start sleeping around, right? The problem with self-harm, self-medication, being promiscuous, those types of things, to me, I've always visually seen that as kind of putting a clean Band-Aid on a dirty wound. You know, it covers, you can't really see it. It feels better for a while. The drugs or the alcohol or the sleeping around or whatever it is, it makes me feel better for a moment, but you're not really dealing with the underlying issue, that dirty wound that really needs to be addressed. So even though it kind of masks the pain for a while, you still have that underlying issue that's not being addressed. So the problem with doing dysfunctional or destructive things, it does two things. Number one, it prolongs the pain and it takes you longer to get to the other side of healing. And number two, sometimes it creates even more problems.
Probably that's what my thought was. It creates a lot more.
It can create more problems like addiction. So if you're turning to drugs or alcohol, all of a sudden have you not only addressed the trauma, but now you've created addiction in your life that you have to battle that as well. So let's say we have another person that's going through a divorce, or one of their parents has passed away, or they go through a bad breakup and they're really broken and they're destructive, and they're thinking to themselves, I want to heal as quickly as possible and as healthy as possible and get on the other side. What would be some things that y'all would recommend for them to do to heal, to move on, and to be better?
Therapy, support groups.
Support groups, individual therapy, yeah. What else could they do to help them out? Besides drinking and drugs and online dating and sleeping around?
Find new hobbies, like find new interests.
Okay, yeah. A new hobby. Music.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like to play music. Some people will pick up art. Some people like to journal, kind of put their thoughts out, kind of write about things. Sometimes people turn to church. They turn to meditation. They may start exercising. Yeah. A lot of positive things you can do. Go to counseling, talk to friends. Yeah.
Get help.
What's that?
Definitely get help.
Yeah, get some help. That's right. So that kind of moves us into what's called mortification of self. So this is the most extreme form of resocialization because it typically occurs in extreme environments. Environments where you really have to conform to this environment to fit in. So the mortification of self is the dying of oneself. Essentially what happens here is whenever you enter into these extreme environments, your individuality is taken from you. It's stripped away from you. So let's say you go to prison. Well, your name has been taken. They take away your name and they give you a what? Number. They take away your clothes, your civilian clothes, and they give you a jumpsuit. You're starting to conform. Whenever you're in the prison system, you have to do what we say, when we say, how we say it. It's not about you. You're going to conform to us. And this can be very difficult emotionally and psychologically to kind of move into these situations. But as time goes by, people become institutionalized. They get kind of used to being part of the system. The same thing can happen in the military, and it does often happen in the military, especially whenever you're going to boot camp. When you're going off to boot camp, that is a major shock to the system. For males, they shave your head, so they take that individuality away. They take your phone, they take your clothes, they take everything away from you. And you're considered a soldier. They don't care what your first name is. They'll call you by your last name, and your job is to kind of conform to this environment. And the quicker you conform, the quicker you learn, the better off you're going to be. And it can be very, very difficult emotionally going through this. But as the time goes by, you get into a rhythm and it starts to feel like home. When you start talking about going back home or going back to the barracks or going to chow hall, all this starts to actually feel natural as the time actually goes by. And so, yeah, you can be institutionalized within a prison system, but you can absolutely become militarily institutionalized as well, where you get so accustomed to the control and the conformity that it becomes natural and it feels right. But what's interesting is that whenever you leave these extreme environments, whether it's a rehab facility after 90 days, 120 days, the military, or you get released from prison, sometimes you have to go through the process of resocialization, become resocialized into society. And that's hard as well. We see a lot of people leave the prison system that have been there for a long time, that whenever they get out of the prison system, they have a hard time resocializing into society. If they have a felony charge, it can make it very difficult for them to find any type of job opportunity. It can make it difficult for them to get into college. And that's why sometimes you have an issue where people are so institutionalized within the prison system that when they get out, they go back to their old ways. Some of the reasons why they go back to their old ways is because a lot of doors and opportunities are shut in their face. Nobody wants to hire a felon. It can be difficult to get into college or university because you have a felony charge. And so what do? They go back to what is normal, what is familiar. They get caught again and they get back into the system. It's referred to as recidivism. You spend time in prison, you get out, you go back to your old ways, and it's just this diabolical circle going in and out. But the same thing goes for the military. People have been in the military, even just for a few years. Getting out and coming back home can be very weird. It can be very unusual to get your car keys, to get in your car, to drive where you want to go to Walmart, to walk around, to have that freedom, to not constantly be looking over your back and wait for somebody to tell you to do something. So it can actually take time to become re-socialized, to become a civilian. It does happen eventually, but it can take some time. I don't know if y'all have ever seen the movie Shawshank Redemption. Okay, if you haven't seen it, I do recommend that you watch it. It was a brilliant movie that came out about 30 years ago. Shawshank Redemption. What's that?
I said it's long.
It is long, but it's a classic. And I won't tell you too much about it, but there's a little old man there that he went to prison probably for murder because he was in prison for so long, and he was a little old man, and he was over the library, and the prison system after all those years just kind of became home. And in the movie it shows how much he really struggled with getting out and being paroled as being a little old man, and how he just so desperately wanted to go back home. He referred to the prison system as home, and in that movie you'll actually see how he really, really struggled on the outside.
Do you think that's why, like, addicts struggle so much with sobriety and staying sober because the environment is so controlled? Like, maybe there would be a higher success rate if they didn't have such a controlled environment, if they allowed them to.
Talking about within the rehab system?
Mm-hmm.
I think within the rehab system, they have to control it so much because they've got to go through that process of detox to get it out of their system to kind of get them on the other side. If they give them a lot of leeway, a true addict will always find angles and ways of getting that drug. So I do understand why it needs to be so highly controlled. What I'd be more concerned about is whenever they get out, going back into those environments where those triggers are.
Right.
If they struggle with alcohol, driving next to that gas station where they notoriously get alcohol from every single time, how do they avoid that trigger? And that's why sometimes people who struggle with addiction, they have to go to a halfway house for a while, or they're even told, hey, you don't need to go back to your hometown. You really should move and get out of that, because everybody you're involved with, even your family, they're all involved in drugs and alcohol, and they're triggers. So the best thing for you to do is to get away from that completely. But people who struggle with drugs and alcohol, the success rate for them staying off drugs and alcohol forever is actually pretty low. Relapse is very, very high. It's a constant struggle.
If they were all forced into, like, a facility like that after the controlled part where they relearn to adapt to life without a substance, that there would be higher success rate.
I would think so, and I think it's probably why they had those halfway houses. It's kind of a transition between the rehab facility and back home.
So I wonder if, like, the people who choose to do halfway houses are more successful.
I don't know. That's a good sociological question. As a matter of fact, I mean, it really is, to really kind of see what is the success rate. It'd be interesting to know what is, and it wouldn't surprise me that people have probably done some research and really evaluate the success rate of people who went to these halfway houses for a while, those people who decided not to go home and live somewhere else. Were they able to stay off drugs and alcohol? What is their success rate? It wouldn't surprise me if there was some research to back that up. Yeah. So let's take a look at some of the effects of abuse and neglect. So anytime we're dealing with socialization, how we're being socialized, not all socialization is good. Hopefully most people are being raised in loving, nurturing environments where you feel safe emotionally, psychologically. You're in a good place as an adult, and you kind of pass that down to your kids. I mean, that's kind of the ultimate goal. But unfortunately, we do have people that are raised in pretty bad environments, and they're exposed to things that have lifelong effects. So let's talk about some different forms of abuse. The first one is physical abuse. Physical abuse, hitting, slapping, punching. So whether we're talking about physically abusing a child or a spouse or an elderly person, which is referred to as elder abuse. So this would be physical abuse pretty much across the spectrum of any age range. Emotional abuse is not going to leave necessarily any bruises or broken bones, but can leave a lot of emotional scars that people can carry for a long time. So if a child is emotionally abused, being called names, being demeaned by their parents, told that they're worthless, a lot of times it can definitely affect their self-image and how they feel about themselves, their perception of themselves, their motivation, how they interact with other people. So there's some parents out there that don't hit their kids, but they're very much verbally and emotionally abusive, where the child has to really process and carry that. And hopefully as the child gets older to a young adult, sometimes they do need counseling, individual counseling, uh, group therapy in order to process and move beyond that. Otherwise, like I mentioned earlier, it's just kind of like putting a clean Band-Aid on a dirty wound. That young teenager may turn to promiscuity, drugs, and alcohol to deal with that abuse of that negative self-image, where you really got to be kind of mindful of that. So emotional abuse is going to be attacking one's feelings. Mental or psychological abuse is going to be attacking people's perception, which is also pretty bad as well. So sometimes you'll see this whenever a parent will blame a child for the parent's bad behavior, their drug use, their alcohol use, physically or emotionally abusing the child. They may blame the child for that. Sometimes you see this in a spousal situation where an abusive husband may start blaming the wife for his verbal and his physical abuse. And this is referred to as kind of gaslighting. Whenever you try to make the other person, the victim, really feel like it's their fault, where they kind of take ownership of it, that they're going crazy, that they're the ones that really have the problem. A lot of emotional and physical abusers will use this technique because they deflect the blame that I wouldn't be doing this if you weren't doing A, B, or C. This is actually your fault. And sometimes you'll actually see this among small children that will actually blame themselves, and they'll feel like it's their fault whenever their parents are actually abusing them. And sometimes you actually see this among women who will actually take ownership and blame themselves. What is it called? Battered wife syndrome. A lot of times whenever women are experiencing battered wife syndrome, they are beaten down to such a point, they will actually start taking ownership of the blame and make excuses for their abuser, and they will actually start blaming themselves. Well, if I didn't nag so much, if I didn't clean, if I cleaned better, if I took better care of the kids, then my husband would not be acting this way. And that's a good indication that the husband has probably been gaslighting his wife to a point where she actually is taking ownership of his abuse. And the only way to get out of that is she's going to have to start thinking in a different way and realizing it's not my fault. This is something that he's doing. So these are some of the psychosocial negative effects that can occur if we don't take care of those wounds, those emotional wounds, those psychological wounds, those physical wounds that we don't take care of ourselves. And these are some of the things that we just talked about a little bit earlier. Promiscuity, abusing drugs and alcohol, self-harm. So if we don't take care of a lot of the abuse that we may have experienced as a child or even as an adult, there are issues of self-medicating with drugs and alcohol to kind of numb the pain. Alcohol is readily available pretty much on every corner in the country. it's very easy to get sucked into using alcohol as a form of self-medication and self-numbing. It's a real issue and a problem. There are higher rates of depression and anxiety disorders among people who experience various forms of abuse and neglect. There are also higher rates of incarceration. A lot of people that are career criminals that spend a lot of time in the system, a lot of them come from very broken homes, very bad homes, a lot of poverty, a lot of abuse, drug abuse, and they're kind of raised within this type of environment. There's also a higher rate of divorce among people who experience various forms of abuse, especially if they don't get the help that they need. They can kind of pass down some of those qualities, those experiences that they had as a child, as negative experiences. Sometimes they can bring that into their relationships. And so people who have a lot of issues with self-esteem and they have a lot of trauma, I don't know if you've ever heard of the phrase that dysfunction attracts dysfunction and trauma attracts trauma. A lot of times broken people who are really broken, there's kind of like a magnetic effect where they are attracted to other broken people for whatever reason, and it just becomes very, very toxic. Individuals who deal with their traumas in life and they become a healthy individual, they are typically not attracted to broken people and dysfunctional people. Because when they interact with somebody who's toxic or dysfunction, if they come from a healthy place, they see that a mile away. They see the red flags all over it, and they are not attracted to it. And as a matter of fact, they run away. And so if we ever find ourselves kind of being attracted to broken and dysfunctional people, it may be somewhat of a mirror reflection that, hey, I may need to work on something within myself. Suicide rates are higher among people who are abused. And statistically, people who have been abused on any level have a higher chance of becoming abusers themselves. Now, a lot of them don't. Just because you've been abused or been mistreated as a child doesn't mean that you're going to pass that down to your own kids. But statistically, you have a higher chance of passing down that abuse to your own kids or your future spouse if you grew up in an environment where that was kind of modeled and learned. So let's take a look at some of the effects of neglect. There was a study that was done in the 1940s. There was an institution that was taking care of children, and some researchers went into this institution really just to kind of look around. They really kind of observing. They wanted to go and just kind of see the effects. So in this particular institution, the children that were born and taken care of, they didn't have parents, so they kind of became wards of the state. Physically, they were fine whenever they were born, but they noticed that the facility of the institution, it was understaffed. They didn't have enough people to actually take care of the children. So a lot of the small children would spend a lot of time in their beds or in their cribs almost all day. So the main priority of the institution was to take care of the kids' physical needs because they were understaffed. So they made sure that they were clothed, that they were changed, that they were properly fed. The physical aspects of taking care of the children were met. The social or the emotional aspects of raising the children were not taken care of. They were often neglected. So since they were understaffed, there wasn't a whole lot of time to talk to the children, to pick them up and comfort them whenever they were scared, to teach them how to talk and how to walk. And so because their social needs were actually neglected, the one thing the researcher noticed is that some of these children that were older, that were toddlers and older, they were developmentally delayed. They were small for their age. They were developmentally behind. They should have been on a level where they were either walking or running, putting sentences together. They noticed that these kids that were of a certain age were developmentally behind. Some of them were small for their age. Some of them had some physical issues. Some of them had some cognitive issues because they weren't being stimulated emotionally. So the results of this was not only were the kids physically delayed and cognitively delayed, they also noticed an issue referred to as failure to thrive, where the kids, since they were so emotionally neglected, is that some of these children actually passed away even though their physical needs were being met. And what this showed is that we are social creatures. We need to be taken care of not only physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. I don't know if you've ever heard of dying of a broken heart, but that's something that can actually happen. There are some elderly people that have been married for years and years where when one passes away, the other one is so grief stricken that they almost will themselves to die, and they die pretty quickly. The same thing can happen for children and babies. If they're horribly neglected or isolated, it can be so psychologically devastating that the child can just lose all hope and almost will themselves to die. And this happened here. So what this basically showed was is that, as human beings, we need to be taken care of physically and emotionally and psychologically for us to develop normally in a healthy way. So feral children, also known as wild children, this is probably the most extreme form of neglect. And this is where a child or a human has either very little human contact or absolutely no human contact at all. And because of that, it has devastating effects on them psychologically. So since they're not being raised and nurtured by humans, they often don't act like humans. So if you have some of these feral children, if they go off into the wilderness, they go off into the jungle, if the elements or animals don't kill them, which typically is the case, and they're actually able to survive, and say they're raised by wolves or primates or other types of animals or dogs or wild dogs, they will usually mimic them in order to kind of fit in with them, and they'll kind of be embraced by the pack. So they're not going to act like a human being. They're going to pretty much act like whatever animal they're being raised by. They're being raised by wolves, they're going to act and walk and interact like a wolf. If they're being raised by monkeys or chimpanzees, they're going to act exactly like them. They're going to be kind of conditioned in order to be welcomed into this. If the small child is found quickly enough, if the child goes out and gets lost and they're found very quickly, then the psychological and emotional and developmental effects may be very, very minimal, and the child may turn out to be absolutely okay. The longer that child is out in the wilderness, void of human contact and human stimulation, the more devastating it is to that individual. And what actually happens is that the brains of feral children are actually smaller than the brains of humans that are being raised by other humans. Because as we are all being raised in this society, we're being taught how to speak, how to learn, how to read, how to write. All of that is stimulation, and it stimulates our brain, and our brain grows and evolves because of that. If you are a wild child or a feral child where you're not getting that human stimulation, then your brain is not being challenged. Your brain is smaller, it's more disconnected, and that's why in the video I showed you earlier, Oksana Malaya, she was on the developmental age of, do you remember what age?
She was young.
Yeah, like 5. So she said developmentally, she was about the age of 5 because of that, and because she didn't receive that brain stimulation that got her up to a point where she should have been 21 years old. So the longer the isolation or the neglect occurs, whether you're out in the wilderness or you're locked up in a room for years because your parents are abusing you or neglecting you, the longer that goes on, the worse it gets. Okay. So let's take a look at some various theories that are going to kind of create the sense of self. So as we're kind of moving into the next exam, make sure that you're able to kind of differentiate between these various terms, these various theories. So all of these are micro level theories, and they all talk about how we kind of create our sense of self in this world. So the first thing we'll talk about is referred to as the looking glass self, and this is by Charles Horton Cooley. And this has a lot to do with perception, how we perceive ourselves. And I talked a little bit earlier how we got to be really careful about how we perceive ourselves, our self-image, based on what people are saying to us, what are we watching online, how does it create our sense of self. So the looking glass self says our sense of self and how we see ourselves can often be a mirror reflection on how we think society views us and treats us, how it looks at us, and how it can create both a positive self-image or a negative self-image. So for example, if we're raised in a loving home, a supportive home, where we are told that we are loved, we are beautifully made, you can be anything you want, then based on that, we're probably going to have a very positive self-image because our environment is kind of reflecting that on us. It'll make us feel positive, it'll motivate us, make us feel driven that we can accomplish anything. It creates this kind of perception. But sometimes you have other people that are being raised in a very dysfunctional type of household where the way that they think their parent or society views them is very negative. The mirror reflection is very negative. You're not going to amount to anything. You're not as smart as your brother. You're not going to do well in college. And so sometimes if the young person is hearing this type of thing, it can create a negative self-image of themselves. It may demotivate them to not even try. So the thing about the looking glass self is that it affects the way you feel about yourself. It affects your perception of yourself, and it also affects your interactions with other people. So our sense of self is created how one thinks others views and judge our actions. And like I said, this could be both a very positive or a negative thing. So with that said, we have to be very mindful of who are we listening to in our lives. It was just like the abusive husband who is ridiculing his wife. If the wife takes ownership of this perception that I'm worthless and I'm no good, well, obviously it's going to affect the way she feels about herself, her thought process, and the way she interacts with the rest of the family. And so that leads to the next one, which is under Robert King Merton, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. This has to do with believing the perception. So the only way the self-fulfilling prophecy occurs is if you believe a perception about yourself and you start acting it out, making it a reality. So if the little boy is being raised in a home and being told he's a bad kid, he's always doing the wrong thing, you're going to end up in prison. If that child being raised in that environment starts to believe this, I'm no good, I'm rotten, I'm a bully, I'm not smart, I'm going to end up in jail just like my dad. If that kid takes ownership of this label and starts to believe it, what the self-fulfilling prophecy says is that there's a good chance that kid's going to start acting that out because they believe it. They've taken ownership of it. They started to act it out. But just because we're raised in a dysfunctional environment doesn't mean we're going to take ownership of it, and we have to take ownership of it. There's some kids that are raised in rotten environments that they reject what they're being told. They reject that they're going to be worthless, they're going to end up in jail, that they're no good, they're never going to achieve anything in college. They reject it. And so they create their own prophecy. They believe, they're internalizing within themselves, I am good enough, I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough, and I'm going to show them that I can achieve good things. So the self-fulfilling prophecy basically says, whatever perception you're feeding yourself, negative or positive, if you take ownership of it, you could act it out and make it a reality, even if it's a false perception. So the looking glass self deals with perception. How do we perceive ourselves based on how people treat us? The self-fulfilling prophecy deals with action. Do we take ownership of this perception? Do we reject this perception? And how are our actions moving forward? The next sociologist we'll talk about is Erving Goffman, and we'll talk about him with the presentation of self and the dramaturgical approach. And this has to do with how we kind of move into social circles in appropriate ways. So the presentation of self, this has to do with reading the body language of people whenever you move into a social setting. So this states that the way that people present themselves in a social setting gives cues to us on what kind of setting it is, whether it's formal or informal, whether it's professional or laid back. We're kind of reading the room. So if you have to go to work later on today and you're called into a meeting and everybody's just kind of sitting down being quiet, there's a good chance when you go into that room, you're probably going to sit down and be quiet. Nobody told you to do it. You're just kind of reading the room. So that's all this is. This is us just reading the body language of people, reading the room, and adjusting ourselves from one social situation to the next. And what this does, it allows us to move from one setting to the next in appropriate ways where we feel like we're being accepted within that environment. So this is called the presentation of self. Another thing Goffman talked about is called the dramaturgical approach. And it states that every social situation is like a drama on stage, that we are actors in this world. And throughout our day, we move from one role to another, and we adjust ourselves. So for y'all in here, one role that you have is being a college student. And so you kind of prepare yourselves to kind of take on the role and the mannerisms of being a college student. When you leave college, you may go to work, and so now you put on the persona of being the employee in the way that you dress, the way you carry yourself, the words that you say. You're kind of acting whenever you go into that setting. When you go to church, you may modify yourself even more because of the setting there. When you go to a party, you may modify your clothes, your behavior, your mannerisms, because now you're kind of moving into that setting. Even what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of performing at this point. When I got up this morning, putting on these clothes, getting prepared with my lecture, the curtain opens, I come out forward, and all of a sudden the lecture begins. It's like acting on stage, but we all do this. Whenever I leave here today and I go home, then I'll become Dad. Or if I go hang out with a friend, then I become Dane, all right? So that's all this is. It basically says that whenever we go from one role to the next, we adjust ourselves. We're kind of like acting within all these different types of social settings. We're all performers. Any comments or questions so far?
Where do the people that just don't care fall into these categories? Like if, like the rude people you meet or people who just don't care what social environment they're in, they're just ridiculous. Where do they fall in all this?
Well, we definitely can't put everybody into a box. There's always going to be people who are non-conformists. So yeah, let's go back to this one. So presentation of self. There's going to be people out there that are going to be reading the room, and they're going to feel like, you know what, I'm going to toe that line, and I'm going to fall in because I don't want people looking at me, and I just want to fit in. And they may be a little bit kind of mousy. And it's like I'm going to do the right thing always. And then you got the other type of people that are the nonconformists that want all the attention on themselves. They bust in there and they go outside the norm for everything that they do. They're just different. The person who kind of fits in may be more accepted. The person who's going in there like a bull in a china shop may either have a reputation for being a nonconformist, may have a good reputation for going outside the norm. But then again, he may not be well respected or well liked because he's constantly pushing the envelope. So yeah, not everybody conforms. Yeah, everybody's different. Yeah. Okay. The last person we'll talk about today, this is Dr. Kohlberg. And if you take any psychology classes, there's a good chance that you're going to be learning about Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Mm-hmm. So just like our sense of self isn't created from the moment that we're born, our sense of self is something that kind of slowly grows and evolves. We kind of have an idea of who we are as we get older. What this states is that morality is also outside of us as well. Whenever we're born, we have to slowly gain a sense of morality. So these are the three main stages that Kohlberg talks about. So I am going to want you to be able to kind of differentiate between these three. The pre-conventional stage is whenever the child is very, very young. And this is whenever morality is outside of them. It's external. The child doesn't have a sense of what is right and what is wrong. They're just either trying to get rewarded for their behavior or they're trying to avoid getting caught and not getting punished. They don't have a sense of remorse or guilt for the things that they do or the things that they say. That's why a lot of times we can see kids being very cruel to each other, very mean, whether it's bullying or whether it's a toddler goes up to another toddler, takes the toy out of their hands and walks off like nothing happens. They don't feel guilt or shame at all. But what's important about this stage here is how the parents and teachers and people in positions of authority corrects that child during this time. Because you understand that the child may not feel bad for the things that they did, but that doesn't mean that the child should not be corrected for that. So it's the parent's responsibility to intercede, or the teacher to intercede and say, no, Johnny, that wasn't a very nice thing you did. You need to go give that toy back to Sally and tell them that you're sorry. So the child actually gets reprimanded. So hopefully as the years go by and the child is being raised right, that the child will evolve into the second stage, which is called the conventional stage. And this is where the young child or probably the young teenager actually starts to feel remorse or guilt or shame for the things that they do, which is a good thing. You want people to have empathy and sympathy, because if they don't, they may be on the spectrum of psychopathy or sociopathy, which can be very, very dangerous. And later on, I'll be showing y'all a video about the differences between psychopathy and sociopathy. And a lot of times they really struggle with empathy, both of them.
When a child is punished, it's actually what teaches them that
Yeah.
more child. So when you have the parents that excuse the child's behavior and they blame the teacher,
Yeah.
that's where they learn the flip side, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, and that's where if a child is never held accountable and it's never their fault, that's why you see them as young adults struggling in the world, because the world is not like that. They feel so entitled and they have a hard time having empathy for other people and understanding how they may have done something wrong. So yeah, it's critical that parents raise their children to be sympathetic and empathetic and loving individuals. So when the child or the young adult moves into this stage, this is whenever morality has kind of become internalized, where they do feel guilt or shame or remorse for the things that they do. So it tells you that they have a moral compass, they have a conscience, which is a good thing. But at this stage here, a lot of their belief systems tend to be very black and white. Their sense of what is right and wrong, and if y'all are raising children, sometimes you may notice this, is that there's a time period in your kid's life where it's either they really struggle with the gray. It's either right or it's wrong. It's either moral or immoral. It's either sinful or it's holy. It's very, very black and white. And a lot of times the things that they're parroting is the beliefs of their parents, their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs. They tend to be pretty die hard when it comes to their belief system, because they were kind of raised by their parents to believe this. Nothing wrong with this. This is just kind of where they are developmentally. Their brain hasn't evolved to a point where they start to discern for themselves. They've been conditioned so much that they basically take on the values of their family, which is very normal developmentally. The third stage is whenever, and this typically happens in young adulthood. A lot of young adults, when they move in to college, or they start to move out of their house, they start to kind of question things, and they start to look at the world more broadly, and there's more of a gray spectrum here. So in this stage here, this is whenever people start questioning their upbringing, they start questioning the way that they were raised, They start questioning the values and the norms of society, and they start to kind of come into their own about, what do I believe? What is my moral compass? I know that I was raised to believe this, but do I actually believe that? And they actually start to kind of delve into that. The good thing about this stage also is this is how society changes. Because if everybody got stuck in the second stage, where the norm is the status quo, then it would have been very difficult for us to move away from slavery and segregation, because people wouldn't have been out there challenging that and questioning society. Just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. And by people getting to the third stage, they start to question that and they start to push back on that. The last thing I'll say about these three stages is that not everybody goes through all three. You can get stuck in one of those three. Most people, I would say, probably make it to the last stage. They have empathy, they have a sense of morality, they're kind of broad-minded. People who are psychopaths, sociopaths, who have no empathy or sympathy for anybody else due to trauma, or because possibly they were born that way, which a lot of psychopaths are born that way. A lot of sociopaths are actually made environmentally. They both struggle with empathy, but typically the psychopath is born that way. The sociopath is made that way. Both of them usually get stuck in the first stage, the pre-conventional stage, because they do not have a sense of right and wrong, which can make them highly dangerous individuals. A lot of career criminals have issues with sociopathy, where they don't have much empathy. They tend to be very impulsive. They tend to be very driven with their impulses. They want something, so they do it, and they think about the consequences later on. That's kind of a symptom of being a sociopath. People who are not psychopaths and not sociopaths, they usually think about the long-term consequences of their decisions. That's why they're not career criminals. A lot of people who are career criminals, they struggle. They're on the spectrum somewhere with psychopathy or sociopathy. They struggle with empathy, and they struggle with impulse control. Some people get stuck in stage 2. And these types of individuals, they do have empathy, they do have a moral compass, but they really struggle with looking outside of the way that they were raised. They struggle in looking at the gray area of society. These are going to be individuals who tend to be very narrow-minded, and their perception is that the way I was raised is what I believe, and I don't want to hear anything else. I don't care about your perception. I don't care about any new evidence. I don't care about this at all. Don't tell me that. It makes me uncomfortable. That's where they kind of get stuck in this stage right here. When you get to a point where you're more broad-minded and you're open to looking at different angles and then coming up with your own perspective, your own belief system, that's whenever you kind of move into the post-conventional stage.
What causes people to get stuck?
It could, well, you could probably look at both nature and nurture when it comes to that. Some of this may be part of their personality that they were born with. Some of this may be the way that they were raised. If they were raised in a highly rigid, controlled environment, they may take on those mannerisms of a very black and white perception of society and the way the world works, because their parents may be very black and white, domineering, very controlling, and so they kind of take on some of those mannerisms. Some children that are raised in a more open environment to question, to think for themselves, they're probably going to have an easier transition to the post-conventional. I think a lot of it has to do with probably the way you were raised and your experiences, where you are. You know, some people can be born psychopaths and they're automatically stuck in stage 1. Some people can be born normal, but they have horrible childhood experiences, and so they get stuck in stage 1 because they don't have any empathy. People who come from highly controlled environments may get stuck in the second one just because it's safe. For some people, it just comes, this is safe. My politics, my religion, my beliefs, it's safe. I don't want to hear anything else. I'm comfortable in this. And so that's why I'm going to stay here. And I'm not saying that any of them is any better than the other. It's just kind of where people land.
I think some people's parents and their influence, even as a grown adult, is so strong they never can get out of stage two.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that the environment that they're raised in it has such a hold on them
Right.
that they may get stuck at. It may be hard for them to kind of to question
Right.
any of it.
Because it's still there. I mean, I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah.
It's-
Well, our raising can have a strong hold on us, for sure.